Our Pax 1776 saws are handmade in Sheffield by Thomas Flinn, available in either a tenon or a dovetail saw. We can have different TPIs, teeth per inch, and also whether they're filed for a rip or a cross-cut configuration. The Pax 1776 is my ultimate saw for doing my fine dovetailing work. When we buy one or specify one, you either want to specify a rip or a cross-cut configuration, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Also, how many TPI you need to buy, teeth per inch. If we are doing dovetails like this, thin dovetails on this sort of 6mm thick timber, I would go with a 20 TPI dovetail saw. That's 20 teeth per inch. That's going to be ideal for this thinner material, maybe 6mm up to 12. Once we start getting over 12, maybe 15 or 20mm thick timber, as we may have on this draw front or the carcass here, I'd want to be looking perhaps more like a 15 TPI saw. Just because it's a dovetail saw doesn't mean you only do dovetails, you'll also be cutting small tenons as well. What you don't want to do is overload the amount of timber you're trying to cut with these lovely fine teeth. You want to keep this for your finest and your best work. The dovetail saws are available in either a rip or a cross-cut configuration. This means how the teeth have actually been filed back at the workshop. A rip saw, generally speaking, will have upright backs to the filing, and then it's forward by 60 degrees and they're filed square across. A cross-cut saw, there's a lean to the back of the filing, normally 8 degrees back, and then 60 degrees forward. Also, as they're filed at alternate angle, going across one tooth, miss a tooth, one tooth, miss a tooth, and then filed from the other direction, one tooth, miss a tooth. What this gives us is quite a different look when we're looking at down the saw. The rip saw is almost just chisels offset for rapid removal and ripping of timber. The cross-cut saw is much more like fine teeth, much more severing, like a knife severing through those fibres. As we're looking at these dovetails, these cuts on these dovetails are all ripping cuts, as we're ripping and going down with the grain. So for these dovetails, this cut we want to rip saw. As we start coming to this dovetail and this tenon, we're now going across the grain for across that shoulder, and across the grain for coming down this shoulder. Those are both cross-cuts. So for that kind of work, you need to be using a cross-cut saw ideally. Our Pax 1776 tenon saw is 12 inches or 300mm long blade. This is a 13 TPI, 13 teeth per inch blade, and where we're using this for is larger timbers. So normally we will be cutting tenons, so it could be tenons, could be a bridle joint, but also we could do dovetails. It would probably be on dovetails which are thicker timber than we might use our finest dovetail saws on. The tenon saws are also available as a rip or a cross-cut configuration. So when we look at the timbers I have here, I've got this long and short shouldered tenon. For this one, it's a rip cut all the way down that cheek, a rip cut down that cheek, and a rip cut down here. So rip saw is what we'll be needing for that. As we come to doing the cross-cutting, when we're going across the grain, this is when we'd be using a cross-cut saw for cleaning down to these shoulders and finally tickling them up with either a shoulder plane or maybe a chisel for the final finish. As we come to this bridle joint, inside here we'd be cutting to take the bulk of the timber out, and again these would be ripping cuts done with a rip saw. The other half of this bridle joint, basically we'd be cutting lots of cuts across the grain to take the bulk of the timber or take the strength out of the timber before doing your final chiselling. These again would be cross cuts to be done with a cross cut saw. I've made up this wooden sample of a saw just to try and show in a bit more detail, very large, how the rip and the cross cut saw teeth are configured. So when they are made, the plate, the spring steel plate of the saw, the teeth are literally bent left and right, so we have set on the saw. After they've been set, then they would be filed using this is a very large version, but basically a 3 square, or otherwise known as a triangular file. For a rip saw, generally speaking, they are filing square across the teeth. The back of the teeth is pretty much upright, And then because it's a 3 square or triangle file, the corners of the file are always 60 degrees. So between the upright and the forward is that 60 degrees. So these would be filed from one face all the way across those teeth to keep them in tip-top condition. Relatively straightforward to file. As we get to a cross-cut saw, it tends to be a little bit more tricky. Similar but very small file again would be used, but rather than filing across square, the file will then be used at maybe 5 degrees. We'd file a tooth, we'd miss a tooth, we'd file a tooth, and we'd miss a tooth. Also now, the back of the file is not upright, but it's inclined or laying back by maybe 5 degrees, 8 degrees, 3 degrees. Every saw manufacturer will have its own idea. And also across at a fleam angle as well. So again, filing, doing a tooth, missing a tooth, filing a tooth, and then the saw would be turned around and the other teeth would then be filed. This is what gives you those pointy little edges, more like knives just for severing those fibres. Crosscut saw a little bit more tricky for filing than the rip saw. To buy one of our PAX saws, check us out on woodworkersworkshop.co.uk and look at our social media channels.